Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 22nd Annual John Edwards Memorial Lecture. This year's lecture is sponsored by the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies and Wordsworth College, University of Toronto. The Edwards Lecture is delivered each year in honor of the center's founder, Professor John Edwards. And we want to give a special welcome to Justice Mark Edwards, John Edwards' son, who has joined us today for this important lecture. My name is Scott Wortley, and I will be the host for this afternoon's event. I'm a professor at the Center for Criminology and currently serving as the center's director. This year, the center is honored to have Professor Boaventura de Sousa Santos join us to deliver a talk entitled Post-Pandemic Scenarios, a View from the Perspective of the Epistemologies of the South. Before proceeding with the talk, we would like to begin the event with a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge this sacred land on which the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies operates. It has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was subject to the Dish of One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. At this time, I would like to introduce our eminent speaker. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is Emeritus Professor of Sociology, University of Coimbra, Portugal, and Distinguished Legal Scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He earned his LL.M and J.S.D from Yale University and holds degrees of Doctors of Law by McGill University. He is Director Emeritus of the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra and has written and published widely on issues of globalization, sociology of law, epistemology, social movements, and world social reform. He has also written in Portuguese, Spanish, English, Italian, French, German, Chinese, Danish, Romanian, and Polish. His most recent project, Alice, Leading Europe to a New Way of Sharing World Experiences, was funded by an advanced grant of the European Research Council, one of the most prestigious and highly competitive international financial institutions for scientific excellence in Europe. Professor Professor Santos is a prolific scholar. His most recent books in English include Decolonizing the University, The Challenge of Deep Cognitive Justice, Cambridge Scholars 2021. Secondly, Toward a New Legal Common Sense, Law, Globalization, and Emancipation, 3rd edition, Cambridge University Press. Demodiversity Towards Post-Abysmal Democracies, Routledge 2020. Knowledge Born in Struggle, Constructing the Epistemologies of the Global South, Routledge 2019. The End of Cognitive Empire, The Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South, Duke University 2018. And finally, If God Were a Human Rights Activist, Stanford University Press 2015. Professor de Sousa Santos also has been involved in the writing of socially conscious hip hop lyrics, as shown in his book, Rap Global. And I'm not sure if he will be performing a hip hop performance today, but at this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to Professor. Professor, welcome.
Scott, welcome. Thank you very much, Scott, for this wonderful introduction. Except for the end, well, it's very devious. I mean, this is my other activities, which, in fact, they are not supposed to be part of the lectures. They are part of a different world. But this is interesting that today, these days, we very often know that there are limits in our ways, dominant ways of lecturing, of thinking, particularly in the social sciences, and sometimes there are other ways, other narratives, other ways of thinking, And this, in fact, comes very close to my idea of the epistemology of the South. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be back in Toronto and to be giving this important lecture that you have at your university. I will start by the title, as you said, it's just the post-pandemic period seen from the perspective of the epistemologists of the South. Well, three preliminary notes. The first one is that I think that this pandemic crisis is the moment at which the 21st century is beginning. I think that, as Eric Hobsbawm has written, the centuries never start on the first day of January of the first year of the century. They start whenever there is an event, a phenomenon that is going to inscribe itself in the contradictions, in the possibilities of change in the following decades. And I think that this pandemic has these characteristics as the first industrial revolution, which marks the beginning of the 19th century in 1830, or the First World War and the Russian Revolution that marks the beginning of the 20th century. Why do I say that? Is because of what I'm going to explain in this lecture, is that I think that this pandemic has the potential for changing the ways in which we produce, we consume, we socialize in our societies. And that's the first note that in a sense underlines how important I think from a social point of view, from a social science point of view, from a legal point of view, from a political point of view, and from a cultural point of view. The second cautionary note is that the occurrence of this pandemic brought with it a kind of a paradoxical circumstance. On one side, it has shown the fragility of human life on the planet, all human life in the north, in the south. And this sense of fragility occurs on the eve of a great transformation, technological transformation, by means of which humankind was showing such a potential for transforming life through technology. I mean, the fourth industrial revolution, the revolution of the artificial intelligence. So we have two contrasting pictures of our time. On one side, a total fragility that takes us to confinement, as now I'm here in my village, confining myself. I'm really trying to get away from the virus. As the indigenous peoples were, and there was a reference to the indigenous people and the originary people by Scott in the beginning. Well, in the 16th and 17th century, that was they were doing, because the colonizers, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the French, the British, well, they were bringing with them smallpox. They were the variola, from which they would not, there was no immunity for the indigenous people, so that they would really get killed. And if they would not escape successfully, they would be killed. So this is a sense of these contradictory pictures that we have in our time. The third preliminary note is that I think that this pandemic occurs within a much larger pandemic, probably a series of pandemics, but a very large pandemic, which is very important from my way of thinking and for many of us that share a critical thinking, is that since 40 years, since 1990s, we have been living with the pandemic that there is no alternative to capitalism, that this society is the end of history, as it was written at the time, that capitalism has won has vanquished all the other enemies with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And therefore, from now on, it's just capitalism and nothing else. And this is a pandemic, because I think that no society can live, flourish, even survive without an idea of alternative. But the infamous TINA, there is no alternative, has been prevalent in political discourses. And that's why, since then, we don't have a civilizatory discourse, at least in the political field. We have it probably outside the political field. But the political field has eliminated any questions about profound alternatives, any discussion about questioning the civilizatory model we are in. So these are the three preliminary notes with which I'd like to start my conversation with you. Well, epistemologies of the South is in the title of my lecture. What do I mean by that? I mean a kind of epistemology, of course, is a very conventional way of discussing the validity of knowledges in the Western philosophies, let's say. The epistemology of the South is an initiative, a collective project, of which I've been very active in, that aims at validating knowledges born in struggle against capitalism, against colonialism, and patriarchy, the three pillars of modern domination. So I think that we have so far had, in the West at least, three paradigms of knowledge from an epistemological point of view. The first one was the Hegelian one, knowledge after the struggle. As Hegel used to say, knowledge comes at dusk, when the owl of Minerva starts to fly. So when the struggles are over, things are quiet, we start our knowledge. That has been the dominant paradigm of knowledge, the one that in fact is prevalent in our universities. The problem with this paradigm is that at the end of the struggle, the only knowledge that survive are the knowledges of the winners. The knowledge of the losers are not there anymore because they have been vanquished, they have been defeated. So we have a problem with the archival memories of the defeated knowledges. And that's why in our universities, we have been really teaching the knowledge of the winners, the history of the winners as told by the winners of history. That's probably why I think that we need an effort to decolonize the university. That's the title of one of the books, my books that Scott just mentioned. But there was also, and there is also, a different, an alternative model or paradigm of knowledge, which is knowledge before the struggle. That's the Marxist model. Of course, for Marx, the working class was not by itself a revolutionary class. It would become a revolutionary class once there was a transformation through knowledge and organization from the class in itself, an sich in German, to the class für sich, for itself, a class with class consciousness. So it was knowledge before the struggle. I would say that both models of knowledge were fundamental for all of us. They have produced exciting bodies of knowledge, but they have caused much frustration as well. We know that, as I said, if we have just the knowledge of the winners, then a lot is left out. The knowledge of those that have been defeated by history. And if you take just the idea of the working class as the knowledge, the only winner to be of history, then probably we are going to leave out also many other struggles of people that don't fit the working class basis of Marxist thinking. And there has been much frustration once Marxism has been invoked, at least by some political uh, movements and even governments in the Soviet bloc, for instance, for many centuries. See? So I think that we need a third model. And the third model is the knowledge is born in struggle. That's the one that I've been proposing with the name of the epistemologies of the South. In the South here is epistemic, is not geographical, because you know that in the South, there are many northern epistemologies. In fact, they are dominant universities throughout the global South in geographic terms, but not in epistemic. Epistemic is just the knowledge of these struggles by the groups that have been struggling against domination. There is, of course, a South inside Canada. Scott just mentioned the indigenous people, their territories upon which we are at this point virtually, but the university is physically located, as many others, throughout the global north and in the Americas. So we think that this is the South because they were the ones that were producing knowledge against the domination by capitalism, colonialism, and I would add patriarchy as it has been reconfigured by capitalism. I'm not going to, probably in the debate, I'm not going to deal extensively on why I think that we live not just in capitalist societies, but in capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies. I think these are three modes of domination, and one does not exist without the other. So in a sense, it was wrong to consider that we just live in capitalist societies. No, we live also in colonialist societies because what ended was historical colonialism, political independence, but not colonialism in itself. It changed, it morphed into other forms of colonialism that we have now. I'm not going to enter in this debate, but it is important that this is the conception that I'm proposing, because that's the one that takes me to the analysis of this pandemic. And the pandemic, these epistemologies of the South lead me to observe and to analyze the pandemic from below, from the perspective of those people that have been suffering most with this pandemic. And a book that will be published by the end of this year by Routledge, the title is The Future is About to Begin from the Pandemic to Utopia, in which I really try to show how I think that this pandemic is in fact starting or marking the beginning of our century. So I think that if we do that, we can see that this pandemic, the coronavirus, has been absolutely chaotic. We know that, but not democratic. Because we know if we look at the indexes and the incidence, the relative incidence of mortality of this virus is immense, the diversity. I mean, if you take the United States or Brazil or other countries, you can see who are the people that are being really selectively targeted by the coronavirus for the most tragic result, which is death. And they are poor people, and they are black people in Brazil or even the United States at a much higher percentage than they are of the total population of the United States. So we think that this selectivity shows that capitalism, in fact, is becoming more and more aggressive, and with it also colonial domination, racism, and also patriarchy. And I try to show that all these forms of domination, in fact, have increased, have deepened throughout the pandemic. For instance, all the figures that we can now have at our disposal show that violence against women increased, feminicide increased tremendously in some societies. In all societies, there was an increase in violence against women, but in some was even the feminicide was dramatically increased. And this shows that also patriarchy was worsened. And colonialism under the form of racism by the people, the bodies, the racialized bodies, the sexualized bodies that have been selected for death by this virus. So you can see that with it, there are many other people that have been, in fact, that's my basic theory in the end of the cognitive empire of the epistemologies of the South is the abyssaline. The idea that there is new humanity in our societies. Humanity is a project. As a reality, we have humanity and subhumanity. And in fact, there is no humanity without subhumanity. That is to say, there are the bodies that are racialized or sexualized, and by being racialized and sexualized, they are considered subhuman. If you consider that in most recent years, 20,000 people drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, that is now a liquid cemetery, suppose that there were American or Canadian, white Canadian citizens. Well, it would be, or European citizens. There would be a scandal. But there was nothing. There was no political crisis. They were, after all, Africans, most of them. They were dark people, dark-skinned people. They were not really treated as humans. They were treated as subhumans, what I call the colonial zone in my work. I think that the coronavirus has emphasized that. And you can see that from this perspective, that capitalism also increased there, because from the perspective of capital, the pandemic is business. Well, just look at Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and see how much money he makes out of the pandemic. Or the guy that invented the platform that we are using, Zoom. I mentioned in the book how much money he made, this young person that invented this platform made out of this platform that in fact existed to bring together the CEOs of large multinational companies. And all of a sudden, all the universities, all social movements are using this platform, which is very cheap as a matter of fact, but are millions of people that they are using. So it's really fortunate. So I think that what is clear for us is that as this vulnerability of these populations increased, and increased precisely because they have been made vulnerable by past pandemics. Because this large pandemic, that there is no alternative, is made of several other pandemics. If you take the perspective of people from below, when they are confronted with this pandemic, this is just one more pandemic on top of others. The pandemic of hunger, the pandemic of discrimination, the pandemic of no access to health, the pandemic of no access to water, the pandemic of no access to housing. So there are lots of pandemics, the pandemic of police brutality. So these are populations that have been subjected to many pandemics. And even in some cases, the biological ones, like the dengue, as an health pandemic, was not over when this coronavirus pandemic started. Was not over, for instance, in Argentina. So we think that, I think that in fact it is on top of these pandemics that these people are suffering and now all the hardship of this pandemic. On the other side, you can see, as I was saying, that capitalism is really flourishing. It's not no crisis in capitalism, at least in some sectors of capitalism, because as I say, it's business. Just mention a case that may be a little bit shocking for all of you, because it is out of the pandemic that business comes. You probably have read in the Wall Street Journal and many other journals that a few weeks ago, water started to be traded in the futures exchange at a time in which people are using more water because they have to wash their hands, as the Health World Organization tells them to do, at this point in which many people don't have potable water, not even water to cook. or to drink, water is now traded in the futures exchange. That is to say, is transforming into a commodity. So this hyper-mercantilization of false commodities, as Karl Polanyi told us, is increasing and increasing at this time. So I think that I would say that this pandemic has shown with this selectivity that if capitalism, in fact, many people have been discussing how the economy of death is dealt with in capitalism, necropolitics, as Schulmbem refers to it. I think that in this case, it was even more selective. And this selectivity was across regions in the world. For instance, geronticide or sanicide, the elderly people in Sweden, as in Belgium, as in Brazil, as in the United States, as in the other parts of the world, they were targeted or they were abandoned. There was a kind of social Darwinism in many societies. So these call us, our attention, it calls our attention to the problem that this idea of this selectivity also comes from the types of knowledge, this pragmatic, technological knowledge that have been dominant in the West. And therefore, these epistemologies of the North, which are based on the distinction between subject and object, that's why we don't know with, we know about, or is over and not under. So our epistemological process as separate knowledges and the monoculture of scientific knowledge as a pragmatic way of rationality, as Aristotle had already mentioned, keeps us absolutely ignorant about the meaning of life, the unconditional preciosity, preciousness of life as an unconditioned human good. This doesn't make much sense. Science usually does not allow even to ask the non-scientific question of what is happiness and why do we do science. So I think that there are all the possibilities at this point for us to think a bit, to pause, and to think about the ways in which this pandemic is really challenging us by the consequences, by the selectiveness of the consequences, and by the possibilities that it may open up. And if it does, then the crisis become an opportunity. And I think that the opportunity is there. And I think I'd like to say that probably in this second part of my talk, I would say that in fact we are probably heading to a situation in which we can in fact try to see something of an alternative. But before doing that, I think that we have to be clear about this. From where are we starting? Let's start from simple things that usually are very complex. They are the most simple questions are probably the most complex to answer. Let's take the hypothesis, the Spinozian hypothesis from the 17th century, that we need an equilibrium between fear and hope. Without hope, we give up. Resignation is self-defeating, is suicidal. Without fear, we may also be destructive because you enter voluntaristic type of actions that may be destructive for the others. I think that what characterizes our time is a drastically and almost repugnantly unbalance or imbalance between fear and hope, the distribution of fear and hope around the world. There is a global division of fear-hope relationship around the world that is very, very unequal. Most people in the world today have too much fear and very little hope. In the small, tiny minority, probably 1% or even 0.01% have just hope because they have defeated all the enemies. They are afraid, of course, of things. But they, for instance, they are afraid of coronavirus, but they can invent bunkers in Dakota. They may invent space trips to Mars. They may invent space colonies and cities up in the space, in zero space, with a new Uberite type of space transformation between cities in the space. They are inventing all of that. But this is just left for them, not for us. This is nothing. So I think that we are at a time that we have to confront this inequality, this imbalance of fear and hope. And I don't think that will change the world unless there is more equilibrium. More people that have most fear and have almost no hope have to have some hope in the future. But in order that to be possible, the people that have just hope must be more fearful of those that are suffering by their excessive hope. That is to say, struggle, social struggles. I think that we have to reinvent them. And for that, we need, in fact, different ways of knowing. And that's where the epistemologies of the South come in. Because I don't think that global social justice is possible without global cognitive justice, justice among knowledges. Because we have been really being based on a single way of knowing, which is, modern science, which is precious. I have nothing. In the epistemologies of the South, there is no anti-science sentiment. Against some other discussions, epistemological discussions, I have nothing of that. I'm a social scientist. So science is precious, it's very valid, but it's not the only valid knowledge. There are other ways of knowing. And science should be led to enter a conversation with other ways of knowing. Because if I want to go to the moon, I need the science, modern science. But if I want to know the biodiversity of Canada or Amazonia, I need indigenous knowledge. If I want to know all the technologies, as I have seen in British Columbia about fishing, I need the complex indigenous knowledge of the populations there, of the First Nations there. I need that knowledge. No science can provide me with that knowledge. So we need different knowledges for different objects. And in most struggles in which I've been involved, we see a convergence of different ways of knowing. Scientific knowledge together with popular knowledge, ancestral knowledge. For instance, I've been very much involved on a movement against agrotoxic products in industrial agriculture. Insecticides, pesticides, they are poisoning not only the workers in the fields, but we as consumers. Well, in this struggle, we have scientists, engineers, biochemists, agronomists, biologists, together with the peasant knowledge that know very well what's happening in their communities through the insecticides, intensive use of insecticides and pesticides. So we do what I call an ecology of knowledges. And therefore, I think that we have to start to think in terms of this ecology of knowledges. So let's see what this ecology could tell us about the alternatives. In this book that I just mentioned, it's already out in Portuguese and in Spanish. The future is about to begin. I dedicate a full chapter to the creativity of the communities, because I have observed that the abandoned communities, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, squatter settlement communities throughout the world have been trying to protect themselves, organizing their protection in face of the abandonment of the state. The state in many countries has abandoned them because when they called for the state to protect them, the state was not there because it has been incapacitated by the pandemic I mentioned before, that there is no alternative, the neoliberal pandemic. So the health service, the public health service have been underfunded for the last 40 years in many countries. And in some others, there are not even any public system worth of the name. So I think that the state is not there, and therefore in many countries it has been there, but relatively, because the communities have to rely on their own sources. They have distributed tons and tons of foodstuffs. For instance, the landless movement, the indigenous people, the First Nations throughout the continent, the Americas, they have organized confinement, quarantines. They have protected themselves. They have produced masks. They have distributed reliable information in light of the fake news about the pandemic that guys like Trump or Bolsonaro was really distributed, and they have resorted to their traditional medicines to improve the immunity. Not, they don't have a vaccine, of course, in those medicines, but they have lots of products that strengthen the immunity of our bodies. So these knowledge have been there, but they have been made invisible, even for the World Health Organization, and made even, the invisibility, what I call the sociology of absences, has increased, but it is there. So I think that when you look at the alternatives, then I three scenarios. And only in one of the scenarios, this ecology of knowledge is that I've been proposing is very useful. The first scenario is negationism. We have seen it in the UK, we have seen it in the States, we have seen it in Brazil and many other countries, actually. The idea that the pandemic was not serious was just another, health crisis, minor health crisis, and nothing is done. Well, in fact, it has been a lot of destruction of life, and many of these people that were involved, the governments involved in negationism, they did that in order to protect the economy. The economy first, the protection of life second. Well, in the end, they neither defended life nor the economy. Look at the economic disaster in the United States or Brazil or even India or the UK now with the Brexit. So I think that we have this negationism is the worst possible scenario, is the scenario in which countries are going to be indebted because of the funding, the needs to fund the protection of life during this crisis. And if nothing happens, then there will be protests at the end after the pandemic, because if these countries are going to be funded solely by the unregulated financial capital, then they have to rely on austerity measures. They cannot tax the rich people. They have to go on foreign debt, and the debt has to be paid, and therefore austerity measures. The problem is that before the pandemic, in several countries, there was already a huge crisis. In Lebanon, in Tunisia, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, mainly in Chile. And the slogans were basta, enough. Enough is enough. People were full already of austerity. Imagine now another hyper austerity on top of the others, policies of austerity. I think that we are going to have more surveillance capitalism, more state repression, and I doubt whether this low intensity democracy that we have will survive. I have been writing about the possibilities that democracy will die democratically, by electing anti-democrats, as they have done in the United States, in India, or in Brazil, or in Hungary also, and many other countries. The second scenario, I call it Gatto Pardo. Gatto Pardo is the title of a novel by Di Lampedusa, an Italian writer in 1958. It became famous with his idea that we may change something so that nothing changes. So do some arrangements, but then in the essential, nothing will change. So I've been writing about this Gatto Pardo, and in fact, I get the best information about the Gatto Pardo are the editorials of the Financial Times since April. And in this book, I go over all these editorials, and you can see that the need for a new social contract, and we'll see that there some changes will be made. More investment, for instance, in health services and public health, but nothing is going to change on the basics of the economy, of production, of consumption. So I think there is a third scenario. And I deal with more extensively on this because that's the one that, in fact, is where the epistemologists of the South are called upon to contribute. Because the third scenario is to use this time and this crisis as an opportunity to discuss the civilizatory model in which we are in since the 17th century and design and start working on a transition to another civilizatory model. This other model, of course, cannot be developed, put in place from one day to the next. That is utopian, of course. We need a transition, a long transition, but transition is needed. And you must start now. Where is the knowledge for that? Well, I think that we don't have to invent anything. The knowledge has been there, but it has been suppressed, silenced. Because this model is based on the idea that nature is a natural resource. It's based on the Cartesian idea that nature is at our disposal, unconditionally, and you can destroy it. What we know today that this pandemic is going to be recurrent because of global warming, because the ecological destruction that we have been producing by the ways of development that we have. Because we have, in fact, by destroying the forests, the rainforests, contaminating the rivers, expelling the First Nation people, indigenous people throughout, peasants, their territories, their economies have been destroyed for mega projects, for agro-industrial projects. All this have destroyed Mother Earth, as the First Nations say. And what is the virus? The virus is a message from Mother Earth. Mother Earth is wounded by this type of development. Mother Earth does not speak our language, but signifies a lot. If we look, take your Canadian companies that are so prevalent, mining companies throughout the world. Look at open pit mining, abandoned, they're desolated type of landscapes. Nature is there crying. We don't see that because we don't understand, we don't speak nature's language, but nature signifies that. Who understands very well? The First Nation people know that very well because they don't partake our conceptions of nature. Because while we think that nature belongs to us, they think that we belong to nature. And that's the way of the future, because that's the only way to reestablish a kind of an equilibrium that will not end up, will end up by the destruction of human life in the planet, we have to really change our relationship with nature. Nature is not a natural resource. Nature is what Spinoza called natura naturans, is the origin of life. The vital cycles of the rivers are absolutely fundamental for us, for our survival. So human life is 0.01% of the life on the planet. But we have been so arrogant that we have been destroying, for instance, wild animals, 83% have been destroyed by our action. What an arrogance. So Mother Earth is responding. So I think that probably the most excluded, marginalized peoples of Western modernity, the First Nation people, they are leading us into the future. They are not the past, they are the future. They could be an example, not only because of the conceptions they abide by, but because they have resisted. They have been there for 5 centuries. And the non-indigenous people, very, very difficult for them to understand the extension, the depth of the destruction, of the elimination of their knowledge, their lives. All this violence was genocidal because it was also epistemicidal. That's the concept that I brought in the social sciences, the concept of epistemicide, the killing of knowledge, because genocide was always the other side of epistemicide. So we have to recover that. So if you do that, well, I think that we can start, and last 5 minutes, how do you go on this transition toward the new paradigm? In fact, we have to have an alternative. And I discussed at length this alternative. The first thing, of course, is the idea that we have to bring in the discussion of the civilizatory processes back inside the political processes. Because our politicians, until the 80s, I would say, they would discuss the civilizatory process very often. They were forced to. Not now. That's what they are in general, very mediocre, very superficial. Because if there is no alternative, there's no real politics. I think that we have to really reinvent that. And for that, the first thing is what I think a different conception of nature. If you take that, then you'll see that different ways of knowing are absolutely fundamental. And we have to decolonize our universities by bringing in all the other knowledge that are still available. They are there, but they never get into our universities. And if you start doing that, then we'll see lots of changes. And the changes have to start by the things in which we have a little bit more consensus now. Where are our consensus at this point? Not unanimity, of course, but things where we can start moving. We can start moving in the question of public goods. Private property is important in our societies, but should be one kind of property that should be protected along with other types of property. Associational property, cooperative property, peasant property, indigenous property, Afro-descendant property. There are many different ways. Cooperative property. There are many different ways of property other than the private property. Why is private property the only one that is protected by our legal codes and our constitutions? So this is the time for the public goods, for the common goods that have been there. Land, water has been there. Can we survive if water is going to be traded in the futures exchange? When we know that by 2050, probably 50% of the world population will have no access to potable water. That's why they are trading it and trading in the futures, because they know that water is going to be precious in the future. Vaccines now, there is a struggle in which you could have some consensus. The World Trade Organization then decided that they should not be, the patent rights on the vaccine should not be put aside. What a disaster. Because I can't imagine of another crisis in which, according to the rules of the World Trade Organization, patents should be put aside so that vaccines should be accessible to everyone at a very low cost, free if possible. That's the project of the World Health Organization called COVAX. At least it's a beginning on that. But most rich countries are are boycotting, in fact, that global fund because they are trying to protect their citizens. Canada is trying to protect their citizens. It is said that Canada has 6 vaccines for each citizen. What about Africa? European Union is very much concerned about the vaccines for its citizens. What about the rest of the world? Well, this nationalism is crazy because we know that there will be no global security if there is no global immunization. And for that, we need 60 or 70% of the world population to be vaccinated. So it is really crazy. But there's a, narrow nationalism is around there. So you can't try to move in this direction. Another one is the energetic metrics. There is some consensus there that our economy is run by fuel oil and by gas and oil. They have no future. It has to be left unexplored, underground, if we want to survive in our planet. The Paris Agreement go in this direction. The indigenous people, the First Nation people have been telling that all along. The oil is the blood of the people. If we extract the blood, we are extracting the survival conditions of the people. So I think that we have to change our energetic metrics, and that other types of energy that really don't create other problems for the peasants or for the First Nation people. Renewable, but of course ecologically sound and territorially sound and socially sound and culturally sound type of energies. We have to move in that direction. We have to move. The transition calls us upon to defend what only peasants have been defending: food sovereignty. The Via Campesina, in which hundreds of peasant organizations around the world have united, have been drawing our attention to the need for food sovereignty. Of course, Monsanto, Bayer, they don't want to hear about that. They want food security, which is absolutely different because it's based on transgenic food. They speak of sovereignty, food sovereignty. Well, now with the pandemic that many countries that were not food sovereign, when the borders were closed, they had a deep crisis. Mozambique was one of them for a couple of weeks. So we have to start thinking about food sovereignty. We have to think about the relationship between cities and the countryside, urban and rural areas. We have been colonized by the idea that the cities are the progress and the rural areas are the backward parts of our societies. Well, with the pandemic, many of us, I have already given my example, have fled into the countryside to protect themselves against the pandemic. So there is no city to live, no right to the city without the right to the rural areas. Cities have to be more convivial with rural areas. Rural areas have to be equipped like the cities. Well, Boccaccio, as we know, would never write the Decameron if he had not fled from Firenze to a village. His parents didn't flee, and therefore they were killed by the plague. But he escaped because of that. And we have the Decameron, thanks to that. So I think that we have to really change our minds. And the peasantries, the rural life is as healthy, probably even healthier than the city life, and we should try to balance different ways of living. The cities should have more rural areas inside the cities, and rural areas should have all the equipment of the city areas in our world. So we have to balance ways of living. Another point, I could go on and on, just two more points and I finish, is that we have to abandon the planned obsolescence of our consumer goods. This computer, this cell phone could last for 10 years, but it lasts only for 2 years at the most in many cases. Or our cars, or our watches. We have to abandon that. And the places where we buy them, these large shopping malls, they are going to become risk zones in the future. Because it's confined air in which you have for 24 hours thousands of people circulating. We have to have different ways of consumption, of transportation, more proximity. The commerce of proximity has revealed itself in many countries as the safest one, because there are just a small number of people that come in. Protection can be supervised. The number of people inside. Alcohol gel and other products to protect the hands is easier. So you have to start changing anew. But for that, we have to have different conceptions of knowledge that could bring us to these other ways. So I think that these are just scattered ideas of a different paradigm about which we should start thinking, not just to implement it from one day to the next. So if Canada depends on oil or something, you can't change the economy from one day to the next. But we can start the transition in many different areas. And I think if we do that, then we may come up what I call a new cosmopolitan declaration of human rights and human duties. Because we have been concerned with rights, never with duties, and only with human rights. Well, nature has rights. It's not an anthropomorphization of nature. Is nature by itself? Of course, nature has no rights for the indigenous knowledge, because if the nature is the giver of life, it's absurd to say that nature has rights. Like for the Christians, it's absurd to say that God has rights. But the rights of nature is there to stay. We have seen them already in some constitutions. They are now promulgating into law in New Zealand. Rivers have been given human rights, the rights of the river, with lots of dollars to reconstruct, to restore the margins, the vital cycles of the margins of the rivers. So there is some change there. And I think all this change, as the case of New Zealand illustrates, is by the strength of the indigenous knowledge coming after 5 centuries of struggle, coming to some successes. They are scattered. I know in Canada also, some of successes that can be mentioned, the way in which Scott introduces us by showing the location upon which we are, in fact, having this conversation tells us something of a victory, symbolic victory, but it's a victory. So, and I see that throughout. So I think that we have to start, that's the only option, the only way to restore hope is by having different ways of knowing that allow us, as I have tried to illustrate in this brief lecture, new ways of thinking about alternatives for society. Thank you very much.
Professor de Sousa Santos, thank you so much for such an epic and expansive discussion of where we currently are, and where the globe might go to in the upcoming decades. I think it was extremely fascinating and thought-provoking, and we have so much more discussion to have here. I'm sure that we can't do it complete justice, but for those of you in the audience, if you are interested in asking a question, please put it into the chat room, and we will try to access as many questions as we can over the next little while. I know that Kate also compiles the information from the chats for our to be digested at a later date as well. So let me start by I'm just going to be reviewing some of the questions as they come in. Let's start with a question from one of our graduate students. The question is this: what is the responsibility of the global West, who have gained the most from capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy? How do we hold, the global North, for instance, accountable for centuries of destruction of communities, culture, knowledge, and the environment?
Scott, are you if possible, if there are 3 questions, put together and I answer them. If there is just one, I start with that.
Okay. Let me look down and
I can
another question that comes in. Sorry, they've all come in kind of at once, so I'm trying to digest them. An interesting question: are Trump supporters expressing epistemologies of the South? If so, what separates knowledge from political projects? Another question: as we move forward to a future with a new world structure, to what extent can we continue to work with existing mechanisms under international law? And how about I throw in one more for the time being? The Western-centric agenda has long ignored the capacity of many poor countries in keeping up with the results. This result-focused operations has been a cause of, further suffering among the poor and disadvantaged in China, for instance, and created unspeakable conditions between otherwise politically opposite. So how do we hold, once again, Western nations accountable? I think seems to be one of the major themes being promoted here.
Well, I think more of this. Do you want me to go ahead?
I'll provide one more. How can or should universities elevate communities and knowers, indigenous and non, those who have doctorates and those who do not, who have been making these points about other knowledges? In other words, practical suggestions with respect to decolonizing, university spaces and gaining access to alternative knowledges.
Well, that's good questions. I'll try to answer. Well, the responsibility of the West, to start with the first question. I mean, there is no other way other than reparation and non-repetition. I think that's what we have been doing, and much of the critical thinking in the Western tradition has been very much concerned about alternatives to the future, but not really taking care of the wrongs of the past. And I think that these wrongs are there. And they have created lots of trauma to people. And I think reparation should be at the center of our concerns. And not just reparation, but non-repetition. I'm a member of the consulting commission of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Colombia now. And I've been doing that for 2 years now. We are about to end our mission. And this commission comes from the agreements with the guerrilla movement in 2016. And believe me, the information that comes in from the violence, from the destruction of the armed agent, illegal actors, the destruction always of the same people. peasants, women, indigenous people, the destruction of their traditional agriculture, their territory, including intrusion in their territories and so on. The ways in which they have been massacred, in fact, the crimes against humanity that have been committed. I mean, we have to put an end to this, even though I think that they are being committed these days. Look, there are 2 or 3 demands against, or at least judicial inquiries request to the International Penal Court against Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. Because there is, by the evidence that you can get from the presidential vetoes, is that was not just negligence vis-a-vis the indigenous people or the black communities, was just an intention to leave them aside. For instance, there is a presidential veto vetoing the access of indigenous people to the ventilators in Manaus. So this has brought this case against the president as a person, as an individual, as you know, in an International Criminal Court for genocide. So this is how serious the situation is. So I think that we have to take very seriously the idea of reparation and non-repetition. And the problem is that since we had a kind of a monoculture of the linear conception of time, that always kept telling us that we are more advanced, the people in the global north, geographically speaking, is most advanced and more advanced than the others, and the others have to follow them, like in the arrow of time. Well, this is a disaster because you can see, look very closely. The most developed country in the world, the United States, all of a sudden, this country can destroy the planet 3 times, 4 times with all the weapons they have, nuclear weapons, whatever. This country has been invading countries all over, not just in the Middle East or in Latin America, but all over. Vietnam, of course. This country is used to be an invader. All of a sudden, is invaded by a virus, and they don't know what to do. They are lost. They could not imagine, because they were so protected from the enemies by the seas on both sides, that they would never imagine to be invaded. Not even the Twin Towers taught them anything. So all of a sudden, they don't produce gloves, masks, a ventilator, nothing. Everything comes from China. So this country behaves a little bit like the indigenous peoples when the colonizers came with the viruses from which they were not protected. So see the irony. If you look closely at the behavior of the United States in the last year, is the typical behavior of the failed state. Or later on, the failed state, as you know, many of you know in political science, moved from failed state to fragile state. State that cannot protect lives of people. Well, that was the United States, was not Bangladesh. So you have to understand that this model is rotten. There's no future in there. And in order to have changes, we have to change our minds, we have to change our ways of knowing. And we have a social responsibility since you are at university. And we have the responsibilities really to decolonize ourselves. It's not easy. You have to be very vigilant. I myself try to be vigilant all my life in a sense. Because after all, I come from a colonizer, Portugal. So I feel this historical responsibility there. And of course, I was against the colonialism, but that's not solved. Because Portuguese colonialism lasts for so long, the historical colonialism, that's why I was part of the movement of anti-colonial movement, because the colonies became independent in 1975. But only then I could travel to Africa. Before, I was not a trustworthy person for the regime, so I could not travel to the colonies. So we have to have a different understanding of them. So for me, it was not very difficult to start a cooperation with my friends in Mozambique or in Angola, because they had been my friends at the university in Coimbra in Portugal, and we were part of the same struggle against colonialism and against fascism. But in most cases, we don't have this. And even here, I have to be very careful, because what is, aid to development is a system to keep the impoverishment of people in the global south, in less developed countries. Look at the figures of the transfers, net transfers of wealth from the south to the north, by far exceeds the transfers of wealth from the north to the south. And we are in Canada. So you look at the mining companies, the gold companies, how much they extract from the south. So this is the real life. And people know that very well. But sometimes we have not been, because we have been aware of that, because our knowledge does not allow us to see. Because immediately we come with the idea of development. We say, well, but you are more development. But what is development, actually? I teach my students in sociology that when even the American students in medicine, sometimes they get very surprised that when the development concept was developed, was created, only 6 countries were considered fully developed. The rest of the world was underdeveloped. Can we imagine the colonialist arrogance of this concept, that I create a concept, and by this concept, most of the people in the world are on the wrong side of history, because I decide to call them underdevelopment. And therefore, I'm the only ones that we are developed, so we show the way to them. So I think there's something wrong for a long, long, long time. And if you had paid more attention to what happened in the conference, in Bandung conference in 1955, that would be very different, the world, because the people there, 29 countries, came together in Bandung. What they wanted was that they would like to have a third way of going in their societies, neither Soviet communism nor Western capitalism. They were crushed, of course, as we know very well. So I think that our task, coming to the last question, well, before finishing it, has a lot to do with decolonizing. Decolonizing the universities is, well, I published this long book that Scott just mentioned, because decolonize is a very complex. First of all, you not just decolonize, it's decommodifying, depatriarchalize, democratize. It's not just decolonize. A little bit, sometimes the decolonial models, paradigms that are today sometimes very fashionable, they emphasize just the colonial, but we have to also emphasize the capitalist and the patriarchal side of domination. So you have to depatriarchalize the universities, to have to decommodify knowledge and to decolonize our teaching. But the tasks are different. For instance, in that book, you'll see that I refer the tasks of decolonization with my working together with students and faculty in South Africa. Well, decolonizing in South Africa is different from decolonizing in Portugal or decolonizing in Canada. We have different tasks. We may some of our tasks may be convergent. And we know that since colonialism is co-creation, we have to decolonize not just the colonizers, but we have to decolonize the colonized, because they have been subject to the same epistemological brainwashing of the northern epistemologies, and they repeat those ideas. So we have to, for instance, for the people that are interested in sociology of law and the state, we have to see that we have more and more. And some of you may have an interest on a small article I published in the Tilburg Law Review on the Bissau line and law, in which I try to show that law has been, in fact, one of the instruments in defining this abyssal line between humanity and subhumanity. It has been also a weapon to overcome that. It has a kind of a dual hegemony, but predominantly law and the state as a colonial and a capitalist matrix, monoculture. It's you have to really engage in decolonizing the state, which is not absolutely easy. But before I end this first set of questions, there are the issues that should be clarified. One is that sometimes, and I noticed that in some of the questions I understood them, in my way of thinking, there is no relativism. So there's no confusion, no anything goes, to go back to Paul Feyerabend, the British epistemologist. No, there is no relativism. Because I think that that's why I put struggle at the core of my epistemological proposal. We have to see which side are you on. I believe in objectivity, but neutrality, something else. In a society divided between oppressors and oppressed, to be neutral, it means to side with the oppressor. So neutrality is no way in the epistemology of the South. So I think that we have to see which side are you on. And on the other side, modern science is not just colonialist science. We cannot really throw away the baby with the bathwater. I learned that from a great leader of the liberation movement against the Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, Amílcar Cabral. And from him, I learned that, in fact, he said that very, very often in all his talks. We have to use the colonizer's knowledge. We are not going to throw away, to discard the colonizer knowledge. We are going to select which kind of knowledge suits us, serves our struggle. That part, we use it. The other parts we discard. I think we have to do the same with science. Science is precious, but it's not the only one. The feminists had also told us, and we in the critical tradition, we know that very well. There is what I call, what we have been calling in epistemology, internal plurality of science. There are many ways of doing science. The feminist epistemologists like Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway show that very early on. Like, Habermas, in a sense, also showed that. I think that now we have to move on from the internal plurality to external plurality. It's not that there is just diversity within science. There is diversity because there is science and there is non-scientific knowledge, ancestral knowledges, popular knowledges, and they should be brought into the conversation. Not to say that they are all of them valid. Some of them are patriarchal. Some of them are racist. We have to engage on an ecology of knowledge. So this is the key concept in my proposal, is the ecology of knowledge. Is because in this conversation, it's not just science that is going to be changed. It's also the popular knowledge has to change by this interaction, sometimes involving also intercultural translation. Thank you.
I don't know, Professor, if you'd like to, we've got a large number of additional comments that have come in.
There is another set of 3 questions or comments. I can, we have another 10, 15 minutes. I think we can do
great.
that.
I'm trying to, this is the first time I've used the chat line, and sometimes they're coming in a little disjointed. People's comments will be split by others. So I'm starting to get the hang of it. So I apologize if things seemed a bit disjointed. This was the question related to Trump supporters, and there was a first part of it that I had missed. And I want to start with it. Are epistemologies of the South always progressive? Are they always anti-subordination, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and anti-patriarchy? For example, are Trump supporters expressing epistemologies of the South? If so, what separates knowledge from political projects?
Well, that's a crucial question, of course. I opened the chat and I can see the questions there. Well, the problem is that, they are long formulations, so it is a bit complex to read all the stuff, but it's very rich. I'd like to, Scott, there is a way, I don't know if you are familiar with this, means that if you are the, the host, you can really even tape or copy this chat, because it would be useful for me to see what the feelings of the people that are here, because they are, from what I see, they are very, very very interesting questions, and they reflect the anxieties and the concerns the people that are with us and in this conversation. So I think that one of them deals with this. I'm looking at this marvelous question, the Q1 and so on. Yeah, I well, the Trumpists, well, they never rely on the epistemologies of the South. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, what we have to see is that what are the characteristics of the extreme right today? Well, let's go back to the Nazis and see what is left out. The Nazis had three basic ideas: dictatorship, political violence, and racial hate. So there were many others, but these were the three. In a sense, the extreme right today, usually they tend not to invoke the first one, dictatorship, because they are using the democracy to build their ideas. But they are proposing the glorification of political violence, as we saw on the January 6th, to be something that is close home. I've seen that in many other places. Okay, and racial hate. So you can see that all over. So if the struggle is against capitalism, against colonialism, and against patriarchy, you can see that these Trumpists are very much neoliberal. I mean, they are in favor of capitalism altogether. What they think is that in order for capitalism to survive, they have to become very hostile to the minorities, probably more vulnerable than themselves. We call that in the political science the politics of resentment. That is to say, if there is no alternative, anti-capitalist alternative, any progressive alternative, there is no such alternative in the United States. I've been living there for 35 years, half time, I mean, between August and December. Well, I've seen the degradation of this society. Well, I think the Bernie Sanders was, put aside by a mixture of legal and illegal means, probably, right? So there is no alternative. If there is no alternative, what is the alternative left? Is victim against victim. So the impoverished white worker in the United States thinks that his way of life is being threatened by the Latino worker or by the black worker that is even more impoverished than himself or herself. So it's victim against victim. We have seen other parts of the world. So once you do that, you see that the agenda, there is a capitalist agenda. And it's very colonialist in the name of racist, and also very patriarchal. So which side are they on? They are not on the side of an overcoming of capitalism, of colonialism and patriarchy. And note that for me, one doesn't go without the other. It was wrong. I have to decolonize my own Marxism, which I also, and I do, of course. Marxism is very important in many aspects for the capitalist lag of domination, not for colonialist and for patriarchal lag, even though there are lots of misconceptions about Marx's conceptions about colonialism, but this is another topic. But you have to consider that all the struggles are important. anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and anti-patriarchal. It is absolutely wrong to think that the anti-capitalist can be separate from the anti-colonial or anti-patriarchal. Do you know what is the drama of our time? Is that domination acts in tandem, in articulation, capitalism with colonialism and patriarchy. Capitalism does not work without racialized and sexualized bodies. So they have to go together. The theory, I take it from the labor theory of value. Is capitalism, the free labor, cannot exist in the social formation without highly devalued labor and non-paid labor. Who produces the highly devalued labor and non-paid labor? Racialized bodies, sexualized bodies, women, basically. So the domination works in tandem, articulation. What is the drama of our time? Is the resistance is fragmented. Many anti-capitalist movements have been racist and sexist. Many anti-colonialist movements have been pro-capitalist and have been sexist. And many feminist movements have been racist and have been pro-capitalist. While domination goes on articulated and the resistance is fragmented, we don't leave this. So I think that we have another way of thinking. That's my proposal to you. And if you do that, there is no confusion here because you know which side are you on. That would be my basic answer to this question. No sound, Scott.
Professor, we have many other questions. I don't know if you still have some time. I know it's much later in the evening than it is in Portugal than it is here. We can also send you these questions that you might be able to address at a later date.
Okay, we'll do that. Yes, I think it's good time to finish.
Okay, thank you again so much for this was a profound opportunity for us. You've definitely stimulated a great deal of thought and conversation and debate. And we look forward to seeing your work, your forthcoming work and your continued contributions to our social thought. Thank you again so much, everyone in the audience, for attending. I'm sorry if we did not get to your questions. We will document them and send them to the professor, not only to generate his responses, but so that we can benefit from your insights into these issues as well. So I do apologize if we didn't get to all the questions that were answered. At this time, then, I would like to bring the event to a close and thank you again, Professor, for participating. Normally, we would have a reception and informal opportunity to have some food and drink, but unfortunately, hopefully this time next year we'll be.
We'll do that next time.
All right. Thank you so much, and
okay.
I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.